Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Tim Allen Williams, Chair of Medicine here at University of Louisville, and welcome to Research Grand Rounds. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. He is from our environmental medicine, the Environ Institute, that has been sponsored by Christina Lee Brown. I always like to give her credit for all that she's done around here. And so I'd like to introduce you Ray Yeager, who has a master's in public health and a Ph.D. And he will be speaking today on the research and practice of urban green spaces as environmental medicine. So Ray has really been here at University of Louisville quite a while. He actually is a cardinal in terms of science, his college, getting his Bachelor of Science degree here at UofL, then his master's in public health and the Ph.D. here as well. He has worked his way up from a graduate assistant to research associate to assistant professor, both in the public health school and now in the Department of Medicine in the environment. He has numerous presentations and numerous publications, and he's concerned so much about environmental health that I'm hoping that everyone will take everything he has to heart and hopefully lung as well. Okay, thank you so much, Ray. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And is there a microphone I need to worry about?
No, actually, it's
fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. I'm excited to talk to you about environmental medicine and a lot of what I do with the research of green spaces, how green spaces affect both public health and individual health. But I think perhaps more importantly, the practice of urban green spaces and how the research that we do at the Environment Institute can actually inform practice, because it's a major limitation in the field right now. So since it's a bit of a smaller group today, if I ever mention anything that might be like common in my field that's not you, feel free to just stop me and ask. If you find one particularly interesting or important that's relevant to what I discovered, feel free to stop me and ask. Because with interdisciplinary research like this, I recognize that we don't all always speak the same language or have the same assumptions and have the same background. So I just wanted to say, it's really nice with a small group like that I can kind of, put out a hand and invite any comments to help translate.
not small. They're online. It's a massive number.
Oh, well, fantastic. Okay. Well, in the room, it's smaller. Yeah, please do stop me if I'm speaking a different language at any point, because I know what it's like to be on both sides of that. Well, so speaking the same language, I want to lead off with this notion of what is green space. It's a term that we use a lot in my field of research, but can often get kind of confused a little bit in other fields. So green space in general is just environmental greenness. It's vegetation, it's things that grows. Like a green space, it can be a park. That's what a lot of people think of. It can be a forest. It can be like a roadside verge with plantings. And it even just includes a single tree. A single tree is just a small piece of green space in our urban fabric, right? And that can extend across, the natural environment, urban environments, whether, that be roadside, urban forest, homes, streetscape green spaces, like you name it. And then also personal environments, so indoor plants, residential yards, anything that's sort of like in your personal realm. And also, kind of not quite included here, but more and more the science and practice of green prescriptions is becoming a thing, where physicians, recognize various forms of disease or, lack of optimal health. And they say, you could really use more time in a park or exercising in a green space or, what have you. And that's another area that we're trying to advance a little bit with some of the work we're doing with biodiversity and how that can have influence on the immune system. So why do green spaces matter? So I like to take a step back here and talk about green spaces from an evolutionary perspective. So this is a paper that was published in Nature earlier this year, basically tracking the course of human evolution and showing that there was a substantial amount of time that early humans evolved in a tropical rainforest setting, various forest settings. And when I say substantial amount of time, it's often like hundreds of thousands of years. So in a way, we're really highly adapted. And that's one of the great things about our species, right? Is we're adapted to forests, to deserts, to tundras, grasslands, anything in between. Um, so there's sort of like a natural affinity towards these natural spaces. But looking back even further, so this was a paper published in Science, basically about the common ancestor of all placental mammals, that arose and diverged into everything we know as placental mammals now. About 60. I like to use this slide for the folks that do animal research. So if you're working with mice, the image of the creature you can see here is kind of the best reconstruction that can be done of the common ancestor of mice and men. So if you think about all the commonalities in physiology that mice have to humans, it all kind of goes back to this little, I don't know if you can call it a rodent, but this creature running around in the forest. And the thing is, as you can clearly see in the image from this publication, this is a creature that has evolved to live in forests around green spaces, to have, microbiota that are influenced by the forest, food that's influenced by the forest, just to, all of these evolutionary adaptations for hundreds of millions of years that led to this creature that led to eventually what we were. So all that to say is we our basic physiology, and basically all of human evolution up until about 20,000 or so years ago has been in green spaces. So when you take a creature like this, whether it's mice or humans and everything that evolved since, and you put it in a situation like this, well, there's a lot of things going on that we're not evolved to deal with. There's air pollution, there's lower rates of physical activity, there's lower rates of just the visual and audio inputs that we're getting on a momentary basis, the foods, the stress stimuli. It's just a very, very different environment than basically all of our physiology is evolved to deal with. So for those of you in the clinic, you've probably seen the consequences of this. So people being stressed out, not eating healthy diets, not getting enough physical activity, so on and so forth. So not all of this is because of lack of green spaces, but that is one component of a lot of the health challenges that we deal with today on a population basis. So with that in mind, it's not really a huge surprise that people who live in greener areas have better mental health, social cohesion, physical activity, and experience better environmental quality. And unlike pollution or traditional like epidemiology, where there's sort of an exposure and an outcome that generally operate through similar pathways, green spaces influence health in many different pathways, and that's highly dependent on the individual and the environmental context. So when talking about cardiovascular diseases in particular, if you have urban green spaces that are ameliorating light pollution, noise pollution, air pollution, heat, increasing walkability, neighborhood quality, lowering stress, improving sleep, it's no surprise that it's good for your blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin resistance, diabetes, obesity, inflammation, all of these things that are components of cardiovascular disease. And as such, there's a lot of epidemiology work out there that has basically elucidated, really enormous effect sizes for those living in greener spaces and better cardiovascular health. But there are many, many limitations in the field that kind of hinder us from fully understanding why this is, the individual-based variation, the environmental context-based variation, and also what we actually do about it, whether that's on an individual basis or on a community basis. So among the main limitations of the research out there already, across many different studies, there are highly mixed results that show different influences on different individuals in one study, and no associations in another study. Some studies show adverse associations. More studies than not show differences in associations by place. And a lot of those studies also use very intangible greenness measures, basically that can't be put into practice. They're just sort of a measure of like, is it greener? Is it not greener? But it doesn't give any actionable evidence. Also, low representative capacity. There's a lot of studies that take place in one context or over a very broad area of many contexts that can't be sort of extrapolated to a specific place. There's also very little causative evidence. Most of the evidence out there is something along the lines of, if you live, work, and play in greener spaces, you have better health. But there's a lot of confounders of that relationship. And, as the physician attending probably know, we need better evidence than just associations, right? There's this whole string of clinical trials to get us to a place where a drug can be approved for use, but there's nothing even close to that when it comes to green spaces and health. And also there's little implementation research. So basically, okay, even if we knew exactly what to do, how do we go about that in the best possible way to achieve best outcomes? So among those limitations, I'll just talk briefly about highly mixed results. This is one paper by a colleague of mine, Matt Browning, and this just sort of very quickly displays that like a lot of the associations between green spaces and physical health, or a lot of the studies out there, show no associations. Quite a few find significant associations between green spaces and better physical health, and a few out there find associations with worse physical health. That can vary also by basically the spatial area that we evaluate this in. So that's one of the things that we are trying to address at the Environment Institute. Basically by looking into the details of contexts and of individuals that might be driving some of these null results that are being observed across the literature or that are highly context dependent. One example is associations between residential greenness and circulating angiogenic cells. So I'm not going to go deep into all of these results that are being displayed, other than to just point out that if you just look at simply green spaces around 250 meters away from home versus green spaces 1 kilometer away from the home, those associations can vary, and some can get stronger, some can get worse, some are significant, some are not. And I think that kind of lends itself to this hypothesis that the effect of green spaces is very place dependent, right? Which is a little bit intuitive. If you look out a window and you see a nice green area versus a concrete jungle, that's going to have an effect on your mental health. But if you're 300 meters away and there's, dense forest 300 meters away in proximity to roadways versus not, that might influence exposures. If you're looking at 1 kilometer, I mean, that can mean many things across walkability and your daily stress exposures, all these other mechanisms that are potentially in play here. Another thing we looked at is associations between residential greenness and sympathetic activation. So with spatial scales, we actually didn't find that much of a difference. But what we did find was a large individual-based difference, right? So much stronger effect sizes in females, much stronger effect sizes in those not on beta blockers, those who have not had a previous myocardial infarction, and on. We find individually based differences in the effects of green spaces. And then also with volatile organic compound exposures. So we found that places with more green spaces, people are exposed to fewer volatile organic compounds, and that when you look at street trees specifically versus all canopies, those effects are larger. So again, that's kind of a little bit intuitive, right? If you have green spaces that are hypothetically removing pollutants from the air near a source, that's going to be more effective than if it's not near those higher concentrations. And then also some stronger associations, again, not surprising, with leaf-on greenness in the summertime versus leaf-off in the wintertime, because there's a lot more surface area of these plants that can potentially basically capture pollutants through a number of different physical mechanisms. And then again, with volatile organic compound exposures, we saw the largest effect sizes or associations between green spaces and less exposure to VOCs when you evaluate green spaces within a 200-meter radius of homes, which again, when you think about it, isn't a huge surprise because it's usually that 200-meter, distance from sources, distance from major roadways, that is really influential with your overall, concentrations and exposure to pollutants. Again, though, we found some differences between demographics. And with that, all of those are associations, but that gives us some really good hints as to what's going on. But again, a major issue in the current literature are issues of, lack of causative evidence. So there's a few studies out there that give some really compelling examples. One of those is a nationwide study that did a pretty simple evaluation of years of infestation of the emerald ash borer at a county level basis and the rate of cardiovascular diseases. And they found basically the longer a place had emerald ash borer, the higher cardiovascular disease was, with the underlying hypothesis being that it was a natural experiment because these places are losing between 20 and 40% of their urban tree canopy after having the emerald ash borer for about 6 years. It takes a while before the ash borer shows up and it starts affecting tree health, and then trees start dying for all of the ash trees to die. In another experimental study, there wasn't a health outcome here, but there's some enormous effect sizes in Philadelphia between simply cleaning up vacant lots and making them a higher quality green space. And feelings of depression, worthlessness, perceptions of crime, gun violence, burglaries, nuisances. And I mean, if you look at this, I mean, almost 42% reduction in feelings of depression after, and this was a randomized trial of cleaning up vacant lots. Yeah.
So is it the cleaners or the people around the cleaning?
It's the people that live in the surrounding area.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it would have an effect on the cleaners too, though.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just imagine if in community-based programs like this, where you're cleaning up vacant lots, if you hire people from the area, you're increasing economic opportunity, you're increasing nature exposure, physical activity, social interactions. I can only imagine that would have an enormous impact on all measures of health and well-being. And one of the interesting things about this is, other than an occasional small tree planting, these vacant lot cleanups didn't actually change the amount of greenness. They did a little bit, but not a whole lot, but they changed the quality of those green spaces, which sort of gives us a hint of some of the mechanisms that could be in play here. And then, as you might expect, even though, there's not strong evidence, at least yet, that these huge decreases in feelings of depression, worthlessness, crime, so on and so forth, are going to lead to large influences on health. So when it comes to causation, that brings us to one of the major studies we're doing in the Division of Environmental Medicine called Green Heart. I know a lot of those in the room are familiar with Green Heart, but I'll give a quick background for those who might not. So the central hypothesis of Green Heart is basically that exposure to neighborhood green spaces diminishes the risk of cardiovascular disease by decreasing the levels of air pollution. And with Green Heart, we really set out to overcome the major hurdle in the field, which is experimental causative evidence. If you go and you install, major greening effort, how does that affect health? Because that's something that's just not known. So that's basically what we set out to do with Green Heart. We started out with this kind of basic timeline of, in 2018 and 2019, we would prospectively enroll a longitudinal cohort of study participants in South Louisville between Iroquois Park and Churchill Downs. In 2020, we would basically do an enormous green space planting in part of that area, whereas the other part is left as the control area. And we would basically compare areas that have been planted with a control area that has not been planted. So if you look at this timeline, you might remember something in 2020, a little bit relevant to the Department of Medicine, called COVID. So that interrupted our timeline quite a bit, especially our planting timeline. So we started planting in late 2019, and then had a little pause in there in 2020, and then restarted and finished planting of over 8,000 trees in spring of 2022. And I'll also note that, because of the funding of NIH cycles of 5 years, a lot of those 8,000 trees were very, very large trees because, if we're just out there planting little saplings, hypothetically, they're not going to have a large effect on air pollution, and certainly not a measurable effect when it comes to air pollution measurement technology. But a lot of those trees were quite large so that we would hypothetically see a larger difference in a shorter amount of time. So here's our altered timeline. So we were funded with Green Heart for another 5 years. So the study is going to go through 2028. So now we're enrolling participants every 2 years to evaluate follow-up. So immediately after the planting, we're analyzing now and have some great preliminary data that's various stages of publication. And then we can also measure as these trees grow. As some trees grow at different rates, as some trees die, as other trees in the urban forest die. And all of these changes happen over time. What is this long-term impact versus just immediately post-planting versus before? So I don't have time to go into it all, but basically we're doing continuous environmental monitoring in this neighborhood to evaluate the effects of the greening on air pollution, thereby, the effects on health. There's also community engagement as part of the study, the clinical study itself, but also part of the planting and all of our monitoring activities. Analyses, and then also implementation research about, how can we not just, find out what's happening, but find out how what we did to plant trees may or may not be affecting health, whether that's types of planting, placement of planting, how we went about it. So for quantifying health, we really had, really, really impressive amount of data collected, because again, Greenspaces can affect health through many, many different pathways. And we wanted to make sure that if we found, okay, there's association between planting and cardiovascular health, that we can also understand why. And that can inform practice of urban greening, but also inform practice of things like nature-based prescriptions. Because if we find, a large portion of that effect is due to biodiversity and immune function, well, maybe there's prescriptions that can be written for just getting out into nature in biodiverse areas. Also, how we choose what to plant to promote biodiversity versus if it turns out that a lot of that's through air pollution. Well, we might want to take planting strategies to reduce air pollution more than other things. So that list goes on and on with pretty much every mechanism through which green spaces can influence health. So we had physical measurements, we took blood samples, urine collection, where we can evaluate VOC exposures, lung function. So these are just images of some of the stations we had at the enrollment events and the enrollment materials on the left. So a lot of my background is what I refer to as health geography, the influence of place on health, and sort of understanding the very nature of those influences and kind of what can be done about it. So I take a very spatial approach to evaluating basically where we live, work, and play, and how many different attributes of those things affect health, and then basically how green spaces affects those attributes and then affect health. So for this study, I'm not going to go into the gory details, but one of the first things we had to do was look at the data from all the study participants, look at their residential address, and just figure out where they live. So that is quite an undertaking. in and of itself to just cross-reference all of those records and deal with, all the typos and in both the municipal records and also participant records. But once we know where everyone lives, well, we can start connecting that to all of these aspects about the residential environment. So one of those is pollution. We have a large air monitoring wing of the project. So if we know what pollutant levels are in any given area, part of the study area, we can connect those back to the participants. There is a group out of Murray State University that's collaborating on the study that's been doing yearly biodiversity measurements at 140 sampling points. So for those of you not in the global health realm, biodiversity is a really hot topic right now, and no one really has a good handle on how and to what extent biodiversity can affect health. So that's one of the things that's going to be really novel about what we can do is sort of an experimental, how is the intervention affecting biodiversity? How is that biodiversity related to health outcomes? And then there's also all sorts of data on the built environment, so impervious areas, traffic, walkability, all of these things about the built environment that can affect our health that can be affected by green spaces. And then, of course, green spaces themselves. So I can go very deep in the technical details here, but suffice to say that the majority of the field of environmental epidemiology, who is evaluating associations between green spaces and health, uses a measure called NDVI, or the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or something roughly comparable. So NDVI is basically derived from satellite data. So when light from the sun hits the earth, some of that is absorbed, some of that is reflected back into space, and depending on what it encounters, it is reflected at very different extents at different wavelengths. So basically, with satellite data, we can collect data on red and near infrared, and all sorts of other spectral bands, and kind of look at the ratios. And there's a very, very specific ratio that is reflected back by photosynthetic vegetation. So basically, by compiling that into a map, we can determine how much green space is in a given area, at least in terms of two-dimensional green space coverage. So it's kind of in a given area, how much is there type of metric. But because so much of existing evidence is using these data, because it's just how much is there, it's not very actionable. It doesn't tell you, all of these important things about environmental vegetation that can affect many different pathways and many different contexts, in very different ways in different people. So there's these typologies that are, the volume of a canopy, the height, understory green space, the surface area. There's the fragmentation, right? Whether you have sort of big patches versus fragmented sort of here and there. There's biodiversity, there's, trees versus shrubs, grasses, there's local context, are the green spaces in yards, streets, parks, schools? And then there's all sorts of spatial interactions. So suffice to say, all of these things are important for the understanding of how green spaces affect health, but also especially what we do about it, what we plant where to improve health. What's sort of in the urban forestry world called right tree, right place, to get a tree in the place where it's going to survive well, thrive, not going to interfere with whatever is going on in that place. But there's also, this idea of getting right tree, right place to improve the health of those around it. So that's one of the major areas that I've been looking into. So you can see here's a map of our study area, and NDVI changed. So you can see these little splotches of orange, smaller ones. That's usually where a large canopy tree has died. Whereas you can see the rest of the urban canopy kind of growing as things get greener. Then you can see these huge splotches of orange where there might be, construction. It's usually construction, but other things can influence that as well. So if you look at this map, so this is kind of zooming into part of the Greenheart study area. You can see these areas of orange where NDVI has decreased around major roadways. Would anybody like to take a guess why NDVI as a measure of greenness has decreased around roadways.
Carbon emissions.
So I heard a few good guesses that actually do impact the health of vegetation around roadways. The answer, though, this measure, NDVI, as a measure of green space, went down around major roadways because we planted a bunch of trees there. And if that seems counterintuitive, it's because it is. Because it's a spectral measure of what is there. When we plant a bunch of trees, when you go in there, you plant a bunch of trees for optimal planting, you also have to put down mulch, and you also have to get equipment in there and like tear up a little bit of grass. And the mulch has a very different spectral signature than things with photosynthesis actively happening. So based on this measure of green space, we actually drove it downwards, which kind of presents a major problem for the epidemiology of green space interventions in health, which is just another reason why we need better characterizations. So here's a map of where we planted trees. So I can kind of toggle back and forth. So you can see some places went up, some places went down, but where we did very dense planting around roadways because they're a major source of pollution in the neighborhood, NDVI went down. So one of the things we're doing is collecting really good data about what we're doing to move much past just using NDVI. So we had many undergraduates over a couple years out there logging every single tree that we planted and the genus, with a very, very high accuracy so that we can evaluate some of these spatial dependencies to yield data like these that we can then sort of plug into our analyses of what was planting there and the impacts on health. And we can also look at the nature of what was planted. So a simple one being, did we plant more evergreens or deciduous trees? Is there maybe a difference between the health impacts of planting those two types of trees? Another thing we're doing is every so often we're commissioning an aircraft to fly over the study area to collect LiDAR data. So if you're not familiar with LiDAR, it's basically laser-based imaging. So the most common context that people have heard of LiDAR is with self-driving cars, where they just send thousands of laser pulses out in every direction every second to figure out a three-dimensional view of what's going on around them so they don't run into walls and pedestrians and such. So we can use the same technology to measure urban forests. And from that, we can develop secondary metrics. So one of them that we're really looking at is called leaf area index. It's basically an estimate based on LiDAR data of how much leaf surface area is in a given place. So here's an image of now a LiDAR image of some of the trees that we planted shortly after planting. And you can see this is called a point cloud, basically a 3D representation of every laser point that hits those trees. And you can see how these trees have grown over time. So I believe that's 2019 to 2023. So a lot of these trees, and I think it's a really interesting analogy for medicine, a lot of these trees were relatively large when they went in. But the thing is, after only 4 years, many of them are 10, 20, sometimes even 30 times larger than they were when they planted, because once they establish, they just start growing in all directions, and they literally grow, the total leaf area goes exponential as they grow over time. So if you were to liken, planting trees as a drug, it's really interesting. Like imagine you give someone a statin, but that statin has an exponential dose over time. So, or any other drug. So, luckily, I think most of this is beneficial, and there's hopefully not a threshold that it's causing, toxicity and harm. But then we can tie all that back into, the growth of these trees over time, influences on air pollution, biodiversity, you name it. So here's an image of one of the areas that we planted, also one of the areas NDVI went down, because you can see all this mulch for best planting practices. But even though NDVI went down here, there's an enormous number of trees planted, and they were planted, you can't see here, but this is right next to 264. So there's a very large amount of noise, air pollution, heat, and visual blight as a result of this roadway being here. So we planted this area, here and densely to sort of reduce the influence of that on all the communities around that. And we can measure that in very, very precise ways for integrating in studies. So here's a LiDAR image of that same area before planting. And then you can see after planting, right? That barrier being developed from all of these environmental harms. So back to sort of that planting map. So if you look at a 2D image again of NDVI, and then you look at a 2D image of leaf area index, you can see some big differences, right? So where NDVI was going down, where we planted, you can clearly see LAI is going up. So that brings us to some of the assessments that we've done at baseline on these metrics. So again, cross-sectional assessments, longitudinal are sort of in various stages of review right now. But one of the things we worked on was looking at associations between these different metrics and blood pressure. So there's already a lot of literature out there in association between green spaces and blood pressure. But just like most of the other literature on green spaces, it's highly mixed. So 65% of studies report beneficial associations, which leaves a lot of studies that don't. Most of the studies out there use NDVI. Some of them use proportion of green spaces in an area. Some use distance to a large green space. But no one's ever looked at this three-dimensional leaf area index measure. So when we did that in Green Heart, so you can see these maps. So here's a true color image, NDVI, LAI, and grass. Like I said, NDVI lumps together any type of greenness, basically. So I like to point out Churchill Downs in this map. So you can see the turf track on Churchill Downs clearly showing up on an NDVI signature. But as you might guess, there are no leafy trees around Churchill Downs, and especially not on the turf track. But when you look at grass, you can see, the most dense grass and most of the study area is the turf track around Churchill Downs. So just sort of, and there's many other kind of little examples I can point out, but that's definitely one of the most stark for differences between these distributions. And again, just calling back attention that NDVI cannot differentiate between these two. And well, sure enough, if we conducted this study in Green Heart of associations between green spaces and blood pressure with only NDVI, we found no results in the full cohort. So we would have come to the conclusion, okay, well, there's no association there, or one of those studies that shows no association for whatever reason. But because we dug down further and we looked at leaf area index, well, when it comes to the leafiness of the green spaces, there is a significant association. Interestingly enough, there was an adverse association with backyard grass. We can't definitively explain why that is, but my best guess is it's just backyards with fewer trees have less grass and vice versa. Or, I'm sorry, backyards, more trees have less grass, vice versa. But that's still something where we'll be trying to figure out as time goes on. And then when you really dig down, again, into that context, that individual and area-based context, you can see there's actually a big difference between male and female study participants. White and black, there was not a significant association of black participants, whereas there was in white. So again, we need to figure out why that is for the coherent practice of urban greening and green prescriptions. Also a significant association with those who are obese, not those non-obese, and interestingly, non-smokers. But when you dig into LAI, well, we found similar but stronger associations. But unlike NDVI, in high versus low traffic areas, we found significant associations between leaf area for those who live in a high traffic area, but no significance in those who live in a low traffic area. So that lends a lot of credence towards this idea that green spaces are playing a major role in reducing environmental harms through which they can influence health. So again, this is just cross-sectional associations, but as time goes on and we continue analysis and these trees grow in Green Heart, we can get a much more direct experimental evidence to test these hypotheses. And then with grass, I mean, so no significant associations overall. Interestingly, I don't have an explanation for this. There were some significant associations between more grass in an area and those who are obese versus those who are non-obese. This might just be due to, any greenness being good for obese individual. For non-obese, maybe just trees are better. So it's kind of not good to have a lot of grassy space versus trees. And then also there were adverse effects in smokers for basically those who have higher levels of grass. So there's other studies out there that have recently come out showing adverse associations with portion of grass and health outcomes. So there's all sorts of hypotheses on why that might be that include, pesticides or, various parts of the urban form. So yeah, this sort of gets at whether these blood pressure associations depend on urban context. We also evaluated issues of equity. So basically finding, as pretty much every other green space study out there that's looked at this, that people who are of lower socioeconomic status or other marginalized groups almost always have lower levels of residential green space, which is a major equity issue. And one of the early kind of outcomes of the planting that we looked at was sort of a self-reflection of, we did this planting and we found that, places at baseline with lower SES have lower greenness. So maybe that's just because, people with lower SES don't have as much time. Maybe they can't afford planting trees. So hypothetically, they'd be more likely to take free trees that we're offering. And we found that that actually wasn't the case. There was no significant association or significant difference between associations of, SES of participants that we planted and participants that we did not. But I like to frame this as a good thing because pretty much every other study out there of residential tree programs and socioeconomic status has found pretty systematic bias towards those planting efforts going to higher SES areas for different reasons. So us having basically even planting across high and low SES was a win. So I'll talk briefly a little bit about place-based context. So I use this image to show if you plant, any given tree in one side of this image versus the other, I think, it's pretty intuitive. It's likely going to have different effects in different ways. So I like this image because it kind of shows the power of green spaces to facilitate physical activity, to facilitate social connection, good mental health, all of these benefits, right? But then you can be at this street, you can go literally one block over from this street and you can find the same canopy characteristics, but a very, very different urban context where there's not all of this that's encouraging physical activity and social interaction. And in fact, there's a lot of sources pollution at the roadway level. So the same canopy that can be amazing on one block, another block over, can actually be trapping pollutants at the ground level and increasing exposure. If it's a particularly, hot heat wave day, it can be lowering airflow. So, paying attention to these micro scale contexts is extremely important. And then kind of zooming out just a little bit, you can see areas of high burden and areas of high physical activity and areas of high numbers of sensitive populations. And the approaches we take to the practice of environmental medicine in communities can be very different depending on these intra-urban contexts. And I think it's really important to keep in mind. So I'm not going to go deep into this study for the sake of time, but one other thing I did was a nationwide study looking at these urban contexts. So basically dividing out associations between some pretty simple categories of metropolitan areas with high versus low density, of categories of socioeconomic status, and then quintiles of average temperature. So then you can compare influences of NDVI versus canopy in these different contexts. So here we have columns of high, medium, and low SES. We have the larger groupings of 5 rows of quintiles of temperature, and then the individual rows nested within each of those of non-metro, low density, low population density versus higher, versus metro, low versus high. And I'm not, there's way too much to explain away here. But for the sake of this, it's showing that these are different, right? That all of these contexts, whether it's NDVI or canopy in these very different urban contexts, these associations are quite a bit different. And that really matters when it comes to, what we plant where, but also from a clinical setting, how we understand the environments that patients are in and sort of what eventual recommendations might be able to be. So that brings us to implementation science. So this is one of the only known images of the study PI in blue jeans, Dr. Rooney Butnagar, during some of the planting. So if the images before didn't convey the scale of these trees, well, here's Dr. Butnagar for scale with these trees at their size at the time of planting. And again, a lot of these trees have grown a lot since then. So with the implementation science, being in a school of medicine, it was quite a challenge to jump headlong into the field of urban forestry. But there were a lot of lessons learned from all of those challenges, understanding, how this practice is being done, how this field works, how we can communicate best practice tenets of urban forestry to improve health. So we're working on some recommendations for basically integration of medicine and public health into the field of urban forestry. And that's one of the things that I mean when I say the practice of environmental medicine, right? Because, in this case, people at a school of medicine aren't the practitioners. It's urban foresters who are the practitioners, and they need the evidence to practice urban forestry for health. So that includes baseline assessments, basically what's going on in your community that influences, community health and the pathways through which planting can influence health, prioritizing certain areas to address those pathways, selecting species and locations to get in there and best influence those things, and coming up with ideal designs and strategies. So as the field stands now, we can kind of recommend that, okay, in areas of high burden, you want a high leaf area density capture pollutants, you want high biomass, it kind of goes with that to reduce noise, keep volume, especially for hot areas. But if you're in a low burden area, then maybe more, worrying about park access and canopy cover and things that, sightlines, things that influence mental health and well-being and physical activity. Rural areas are kind of all over the place, but in general, it seems like just more biodiversity, more canopy, and more physical activity promotion is good. But that only gives us so much evidence to work with, right? There's still all of these issues that are outstanding of individual level variation, microscale urbanicity, areas of climate, types of trees that you plant. So those are some of the things that we're trying to address with Greenheart and other studies. And really, all of these things that are serving as barriers are these big research gaps that prevent the practice of environmental medicine as it pertains to green spaces. So kind of digging down a little bit more, if you are practicing environmental medicine, if you're an urban forester or you're someone from public health or someone from medicine engaging with those fields, here are kind of the recommendations we can give as of now and where things are headed. And we're trying to dig into a little bit more about evaluating specific environmental risks and basically coming up with planting approaches that address those risks to improve health. So all those planting approaches that are place-based already exist for just planting trees and keeping them alive, but they don't exist for best improving health. So here, that green space buffer that I've shown you a few times now, you can see this idea of assessing what the risks are, right, with heat absorption, radiation, air pollution, noise, stormwater, biodiversity, aesthetic blight, greenhouse gas emissions, and then all of the considerations that might be involved in best addressing this risk, right? With minimal canopy hang. Okay, we don't want to trap those pollutants at ground level. Augmenting noise reduction of the sound wall, so getting a lot of biomass in there for noise reduction. A staged layout, so if you have a really dense planting that's kind of homogeneous, airflow can just sort of go up, over, and back down and bring all the pollutants with it. But if you have the stage planting, it allows air infiltration. It creates all these micro eddies within the canopy, and allows airflow through the canopy and in the canopy to basically maximize contact of air pollutants with the surface area of trees and thereby capture of a lot of that air pollution. And then there's sort of like, practical things about, safety and visibility, about a multi-stem barrier at ground level. So if a car veers off of the road, they just don't hit a tree, they hit a shrub, right? So that's a lot safer. That's beyond just the environmental, it's, the safety aspect of this. And then, mulch as a practical thing, mulch to keep the trees alive, mulch to reduce maintenance needs, and reduce pushback from areas saying people saying like, oh, this is expensive, we don't want to do it. So, back with that idea of, using LAI for the research and evaluating these in different ways, I like to kind of end with this short story about one of the trees we planted. So this is the leaf area index, basically signature of one of the trees we planted on the left, and how it's grown over 4 years on the right. So for those of you who are very familiar with such data, it's actually really impressive because this tree has grown about 15 times in total leaf area index in these 4 years from the time it was originally planted, which is awesome for all the services it provides. So this was actually the first tree we planted as part of Green Heart. And we had a little ceremony with the mayor, the kids were involved. They had an educational program with Greenspaces, and they came out and sang a song about trees. It was really adorable. They even named the tree. So this tree's name is Unique. So here is Unique at the time of planting with then Mayor Fisher, and all the kids at the elementary school. So I like to check on Unique every once in a while. So here's a Google Street View image from a couple years later. And you can see, like, look at the ground around Unique. Unique's getting used. Unique's facilitating social interaction and shade and physical activity, in a way that's like pretty obvious for not that big of a tree, especially relative to the rest of the urban canopy. So a couple years after that, those same kids that were there at planting came back for Unique's birthday party and had another little ceremony. Again, you can see how much it's grown, how much all of those benefits have increased over time. And then I was just out there about 2 months ago, and here's Unique now, about 6 years later, right? And look at this. We just happened to drive by on a tour of the neighborhood. And look, all the kids, they're under Unique. They're playing, they're socializing, they're getting all of those environmental benefits. So I think a lot of times we sort of, what's the saying? We miss the forest for the trees or the trees for the forest, right? So we can talk about all these urban and like research things, but I think sometimes it's important to just point out in real terms all of the benefits that one tree can provide. So if this tree is providing, benefits to these children, those are benefits those kids are going to carry with them through the rest of their lives. This tree is going to keep growing and providing greater benefits to the rest of the kids playing that schoolyard and generations to come, and providing benefits to those around it. So Unique at the time of planting was the only tree in the schoolyard, and it has completely transformed the nature of the schoolyard. So I think it's important to talk, occasionally about not just the abstract benefits of the urban canopy, to point out one example of one tree. So for Green Heart, I of course have to acknowledge the thousands of people that have been involved in the study in one way or another. Hundreds of volunteers, over 1,000 study participants, dozens of researchers, dozens, if not hundreds of students over the years. All, are essential to the project at this scale. And that's part of the reason no one's ever done this before, is because it's hard. It requires a lot of resources, it requires a lot of people, it requires a lot of involvement. And then, of course, to the study team, Dr. Bitnagar, our principal investigator, all the co-investigators, and again, the many, many other people that have been involved in the study, sub-studies over the years. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So pretty amazing, and it's really good that it's good hard science, good technological stuff, and if you'll excuse the punniness of what I'm going to ask, have you
done much of an environmental scan of who else is doing this? Louisville is leading the way, or is it leading the way? Uh, what does the landscape look like around the country to do this in all the urban areas where, and to try to help us with healthcare disparities?
Louisville is absolutely leading the way, first of all. When I talk to colleagues in this field, I mean, they're all just they're at a loss for words about like the scale and ambition of people in the School of Medicine that are willing to take a longitudinal project of planting thousands of trees, because this isn't our wheelhouse of, wet lab analysis, of data analysis, of study enrollment, right? This is a whole other beast, as we discovered firsthand. And there's, all these pushes for all this need for, integrative medical research and cross-disciplinary collaborations, right? But there's also a reason it doesn't get done very often, because it's really hard. So yeah, we are leading the way in that. And there are a few other studies with existing cohorts that are evaluating the effects of planting on that existing cohort. But there's not like deliberately designed plantings. There's not the community engagement aspect. There's nowhere near the density of the study cohort around the intervention. And even those are few and far between. I can't think of any off the top of my head in the US, but there's a few around the world.
Wow. Well, that is really remarkable. Any other questions?
Yeah.
That was a fantastic overview of the project. I really appreciate that. And obviously you've introduced some new metrics that really improved the ability to dive into some of this stuff, the leafiness index better than the existing satellite imagery. But then you showed us some examples where the leafiness index isn't going to capture it all. The farmer's market street versus the crowded.
Exact same LAI.
So where are you in developing some of these new metrics that might capture those differences?
Yeah, so one of the ways I've been trying to pick that apart is just by evaluating spatial dependency. So you may have seen in one of the figures, we evaluated street trees versus like away from street trees, right? But getting much, much more granular with that. So, as we start to dig into this, we can look at the effects of, planting along streets with a sidewalk versus planting along streets with no sidewalk, planting away from streets versus along streets, planting along busy roads versus not as busy roads, and sort of looking, stratifying all of this and, working with, our epidemiologists and, all the great people on the study team to sort of figure out like new methods to sort of pick all of this apart. And then there's also the, not as much my background, but there's the physiological aspects too. There's also the pollution aspects. So, hypothetically, because we can measure urinary volatile organic compound metabolites, we could actually see that like, okay, maybe some people are getting big reductions in VOCs and some people are not. So then we can spatially interrogate that and say, okay, where are the people who are getting these reductions? And once we know where, we can try to figure out why.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah. As far as